The morning they buried Thomas Calloway, the ground was too frozen to dig
This
properly,
quadrant here, the
and the
survey
men from the
lines are
mine had to use
inconsistent with the 68
pickaxes to
grand.
break through the
Ma'am, the
top
county
layer of
surveyor...
Ohio clay. Wren stood at the edge of the hole they eventually made and watched them lower her husband into it. And she thought
You
about the
certainly
fact
earned
that
your
the
keep.
earth had resisted giving him back just as stubbornly as the mine had resisted giving him up. 3 days after the collapse, when they finally reached the section where Thomas and 4 other men had been working, there was nothing left to argue about. The earth had made its decision. Wren made hers standing right there at the graveside with Della pressed against her left hip and Coop asleep against her right shoulder, his small chest rattling faintly with the cold he'd had since October. She would not stay in Columbus. The decision wasn't grief, though. Grief was present in everything she touched for months afterward. It wasn't pride, though. The neighbors had already begun the particular kindness that felt like pity wearing a Sunday coat. It was mathematics. Thomas had borrowed against the house to cover the bad season of 1885, then borrowed again when the mine cut wages in the spring of 1886. The numbers on the paper the bank man laid out on her kitchen table 2 weeks after the funeral were clean. Simple final. After selling the furniture, the horse, the teaching materials she'd accumulated over 8 years in the schoolroom, the good dishes her mother had sent from Pennsylvania when she married Wren Calloway would have enough to pay what was owed purchase. 3 train tickets west and arrived somewhere new with $11 in her coat pocket. She spent 4 evenings reading the government pamphlets about the Homestead Act before she chose Nebraska. The pamphlets were written by men who had never farmed anything full of phrases like boundless opportunity and fertile promise. But between those phrases were the actual numbers, and the numbers told a different story than the words did. 160 acres free to anyone willing to live on it for 5 years and make improvements. The catch was that all the good land, the flat, black-soiled prairie within reasonable distance of water, had been claimed by men who arrived earlier. What remained in Harlan County by the winter of 1886 was the difficult land, the broken land, the land that required something beyond ordinary stubbornness to make workable. Wren had read enough to understand she was choosing difficulty. She chose it anyway. The train from Columbus took 2 days and smelled of coal smoke and other people's food. Della sat with her back perfectly straight for most of the journey, watching the landscape change through the window, with the focused attention she brought to everything, cataloging what she saw in a small notebook Wren had saved from the school supplies before selling the rest. Coop slept across both their laps for long stretches, his breathing easier in the dry car air than it had been all autumn in the damp Ohio house. Wren watched her children and calculated. $11 minus the connecting fare from the junction to Dustfall would leave her $8. $8 was a number she kept returning to, turning it over in her mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand, testing its weight, checking for edges. $8 was not enough for lumber, not enough for a proper stove, or enough nails to build walls with, or enough glass for windows. $8 was enough for flour salt coffee and a second-hand rifle with 14 cartridges if she bargained carefully, which she intended to do. The land office in Dustfall occupied the front room of a building that also served as the postmaster's office, and on alternating Tuesdays the magistrate's court. Edwin Marsh ran all 3 functions with the efficiency of a man who had learned that paperwork properly managed could substitute for wisdom. He was 50 years old, wore a collar so stiff it appeared to be holding his chin up by force, and looked at Wren Calloway the way a man looks at a document submitted in the wrong format. Not with hostility exactly, but with the particular weariness of someone who will have to explain why it won't work. He took in what stood before him, a woman of 34, slight enough that her coat hung with room to spare, brown hair pulled back under a traveling hat that had done better days' eyes the color of weathered slate that moved across his office with the quick inventory of someone accustomed to assessing a room's resources before committing to a position. She did not look like she was asking for anything. She looked like she was conducting a transaction she had already decided to complete. The land available was Rimrock Bluff. Marsh spread the county map across his desk and pointed to a section marked in the northeastern corner with diagonal lines indicating terrain too broken for cultivation. A chalk formation, he explained. Limestone outcroppings, no agricultural value. Previous claimants had surveyed it, rejected it, moved on to sections with actual soil. The Homestead Act made no promises about the quality of what it offered, only its existence. 160 acres of rock and chalk bluff, free if she wanted it. Wren studied the map. The bluff ran along a ridge above the county's flatland, which meant it was elevated, which meant it drained well, which meant it wouldn't flood. Bitterwater Creek passed 3 miles south, which was far but not impossible. She thought about the chalk. Limestone stayed dry. Limestone also held temperature in ways that clay and sod did not, a fact she'd encountered in a geography reader she'd taught from for 6 years, in a chapter about cave systems that she'd always found more interesting than the children had. She signed the papers. Marsh watched her press her signature onto the line with the expression of a man who has stopped trying to talk people out of their own decisions. Outside, she heard him through the open window speaking to someone in the back room, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a verdict. Come spring, we'll be processing 3 more death certificates. Wren walked her children toward the wagon she'd arranged to borrow from the liveryman for the ride out to the claim, and she did not look back. The first thing she noticed about Rimrock Bluff was the silence. Not the absence of sound. The wind moved constantly across the chalk formations, and meadowlarks had established territories in the scrub below, but a particular quality of stillness that seemed to exist behind the sound, as if the stone itself were holding its breath. The formation rose 40 feet above the surrounding plain, pale and layered, scored by a century of rain, into ridges and channels that caught the late afternoon light and threw shadows in shapes that changed as the sun moved. The cave was not immediately visible from the approach. It sat in the bluff's eastern face, partially obscured by a shelf of rock that jutted out above it like a brow. Wren found it by walking the base of the formation with Della beside her, Coop riding on her back in the improvised carrier she'd fashioned on the train from a length of canvas. The entrance was 4 feet wide at ground level and expanded to roughly 9 feet across at shoulder height, with a ceiling that arched to perhaps 10 feet at the highest point inside, before the cave narrowed and ran back into the chalk for 18 feet. The floor was uneven limestone scattered with rock debris and the bones of small animals that had come inside to die over decades. Water stains ran down the back wall in pale brown lines. The smell was mineral dry, very faintly, of something that had once been alive. Coop sat down at the entrance, immediately picked up a small curved bone, and held it up for examination. Della walked to the back of the cave, placed both palms flat against the wall, and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, the way she did when she was paying attention to something she couldn't name yet. It was August. Outside, the prairie was baking under a sun that had been relentless since June. The temperature in Dustfall's general store, which Walt Pryor kept shuttered to preserve his stock, registered 91 degrees on the thermometer nailed beside the door. Inside the cave, the air was cool against Wren's forearms, where she'd rolled her sleeves to the elbow. Not merely shaded. Cool in a way that didn't vary from the entrance to the back wall, cool in a way that felt structural rather than incidental. She put her wrist against the limestone. It was the temperature of the water in a deep well. She stood there longer than she needed to. Something was forming in the back of her mind, not yet a plan, more like the beginning of a question, whose answer might change the shape of every other question she'd been carrying since Columbus. Coop appeared at her elbow, pressing the small bone into her hand with the ceremonial seriousness of a person making an offering. She took it, closed her fingers around it, thanked him with the gravity the gesture deserved. The borrowed wagon had to go back to Dustfall the following morning. Wren unloaded her supplies, the flour sack, the coffee tin, the salt, the rifle wrapped in oilcloth, the blankets, the canvas sack that held their clothing, and stacked them against the cave wall in the order she would need to access them. She worked quickly, establishing the logic of the space before the light changed. Della helped without being asked, moving items with the silent competence that had always made her seem older than 8 years warranted. Coop sat in the entrance with his bone collection growing around him. That night, lying on a blanket spread over the uneven limestone, with both children asleep against her sides, Wren began to calculate. 1 quart of firewood equaled 128 cubic feet. The memory was precise. She'd taught the unit conversion twice a year in the arithmetic lessons, using the woodshed behind the schoolhouse as the practical example. A cord stacked 4 feet wide by 4 feet high by 8 feet long. Weight between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds, depending on the species of wood, with dense hardwoods at the heavier end, and cottonwood, which was what grew along Bitterwater Creek, considerably lighter. 8 cords was the standard estimate for wintering a cabin in Nebraska. She had read this in 2 separate homesteading guides, seen it confirmed in letters printed in the Columbus paper from settlers who had survived their first winters and wanted to warn those who came after. 8 cords minimum for a properly built cabin with a good stove. She was sleeping in a cave with no stove. 8 cords was approximately 28,000 pounds of wood. She weighed 115 pounds. She could carry realistically 40 to 50 pounds per trip. Bitterwater Creek was 3 miles south. 6 miles round trip per load. 28,000 pounds divided by 50 pounds per trip was 560 trips. 560 trips multiplied by 6 miles was 3,360 miles of walking, not counting the cutting, the splitting, the stacking. She would need to complete this before the first heavy snow made the creek impassable, which in Nebraska typically occurred by late November. It was currently August. The numbers didn't close. No matter how she arranged them, subtracted for optimism, added hours to the day, the numbers described something impossible. She lay in the dark cave listening to Coop's breathing, still slightly raspy, slightly wet, and she did not allow herself to panic because panic burned energy she could not afford to replace, but she held the impossibility in her mind and turned it slowly, the way you turn a problem in arithmetic that refuses to resolve, looking for the error in your own assumptions. The error, when she found it, took 3 nights. She had been calculating for a cabin for a space that started at whatever the outdoor temperature happened to be and had to be raised to 65 degrees using only fire. The standard assumption. Every guide, every letter, every experienced homesteader's advice rested on that same baseline: you were fighting the whole gap between outside and inside. But the cave was 54 degrees. She had measured it by leaving the tin coffee mug filled with water inside the cave and checking it morning, midday, evening. The temperature of the water didn't change. The cave didn't warm during the day or cool at night. It held 54 degrees with the consistency of a natural law, because that was what deep limestone did. It absorbed the Earth's own geothermal steadiness and reflected it back, regardless of what the air above ground was doing. If the cave held 54 degrees in January, and it would, the same principle that kept it cool in August would prevent it from dropping further in winter, then she didn't need to heat a space from 0 degrees to 65. She needed to close the mouth of the cave, create a sealed interior space, burn enough wood to raise that space from 54 degrees to something livable. The gap she was fighting was 15 degrees instead of 65. She sat up in the dark, careful not to wake the children. The arithmetic changed entirely. The amount of wood required to maintain 15 degrees of difference in a small sealed space was a fraction of what a cabin needed. She began estimating volumes. The cave mouth was roughly 9 feet wide and 10 feet high. If she sealed it with a curved wall, not flat curved because a curved structure under compression was stronger than a flat one, and created an interior antechamber perhaps 8 feet deep, the volume of air she'd need to heat was approximately 700 cubic feet, small enough that a fire the size of 2 cupped hands might hold 60 degrees for hours. The question was what to build the wall from. She had $8 a cave and whatever she could find within walking distance. She taught from a geography reader in Columbus that had a chapter on structures built without conventional materials. She remembered a photograph in that chapter, a dome-shaped dwelling, the caption reading, "Wiki Up Apache, construction, bent sapling frame, natural covering." The structural principle was ancient and simple flexible poles driven into the ground, bent toward each other at the apex, lashed where they crossed. The dome shape distributed stress along the curve rather than concentrating it at joints, which was why it was stable without nails, without mortar, without any of the conventional fasteners that required money. Willows grew along Bitterwater Creek. Willows were flexible enough to bend without splitting if you soaked them first. She had a hatchet she hadn't bought yet, but intended to the cheapest one in the Dustfall hardware section, 78 cents, and she had time if she used it without waste. The covering was the remaining problem. She could cut willow withes for the frame herself. She could drive them into the limestone floor. The chalk was softer than it looked. She'd already tested it with her knife, soft enough to carve holes with patience. But covering required something wind-resistant, something that would stop the cold from threading through, and she had no hides, no lumber, no canvas to spare from what she was using for bedding. She thought about the alley behind Walt Pryor's general store. She'd seen it when the wagon passed on the way out of town, a heap of discarded tins cans from preserved goods, the detritus of a store's operations that nobody had any use for. Tin flattened, overlapped like roof shingles wired to a willow frame. It wasn't insulation, but it was a wind barrier over a sealed limestone cave that held 54 degrees was something entirely different from a wind barrier over open prairie. It would work. She held the idea up in the dark and looked at it from every angle she could imagine, testing it against what she knew about heat transfer from the schoolroom lessons, against what she'd observed about the cave's temperature behavior, against the basic structural logic of compression arches. It held. The gaps in her reasoning were real but fillable. The materials were available. The labor was enormous but calculable. The numbers closed. She lay back down next to Coop, pulled the blanket up over his shoulder where it had slipped, and for the first time since Thomas went into the ground, allowed herself something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. The particular calm that comes not from certainty, but from having a plan that makes sense. She was in Dustfall by first light with Della and Coop walking alongside her on the 9-mile road that was more track than rode two-wheel ruts in short grass prairie that wandered slightly with the terrain, but arrived at Dustfall reliably if you followed it without deviation. Walt Pryor's general store occupied the largest building on Dustfall's single commercial street. Pryor himself was already behind the counter when Wren pushed the door open, a man of 52, whose belt was doing significant work and whose fingers were stained a permanent amber from the pipe he kept going from opening to closing. He looked at Wren, looked at the children, looked back at Wren. She told him what she needed: flour salt coffee and the rifle in the case on the back wall with the card reading "Used Works Fine, $3.50. She'd already seen it through the window on the way past. She asked about ammunition. 14 cartridges came with it, Pryor said. She said she'd take it. She counted out the money while he watched. Then she asked about the tin cans behind the store. Pryor's expression shifted through several phases: surprise, calculation, then the particular satisfaction of a man who has decided something confirms what he already believed. He walked her to the back door and showed her the pile. 2 years of tin accumulation, cans of every size from oysters to tomatoes, rusted on the outside, some crushed heaped against the building's back wall in a mound that reached Wren's shoulder. He'd give her every one, free. He'd add whatever the hotel could spare. He laughed as he said it, not the laugh of a man genuinely amused, but the laugh of a man establishing a social position relative to someone he considers beneath him. You know what people are already saying about you in this town? The widow woman who's going to live in a cave. Now you want to build something out of garbage. He leaned forward across the back door frame, close enough that she could smell the pipe tobacco absorbed into his shirt over years. His voice dropped into the register men use when they want a proposal to sound like concern. When you give up, and you will give up, they all do, you come see me. I might be able to find some work for a woman in your situation. Something that'd keep you and those children fed until you could afford a ticket somewhere sensible. He smiled, showing teeth that had not benefited from regular attention. And when that day comes, you remember I told you so now. Wren looked at him for a moment. The tin cans were behind him. The rifle was wrapped in its oilcloth under her arm. I'll take the cans, she told him. She left with the supplies she'd budgeted for the rifle and the arrangement that she'd come back with the canvas sack twice a week to collect whatever tins had accumulated. Pryor watched her go from the doorway with the expression of a man who has made a private wager with himself and is confident about the outcome. He was already thinking about that bluff parcel, about what chalk limestone could fetch from the construction suppliers in Arapahoe, about how long a woman alone with 2 children and $8 could hold a homestead claim before the land reverted to public domain and became available for a man with actual resources to file on. He did not think it would take long. Walking back along the track toward Rimrock Bluff, Della matched her pace without complaint. Coop lasted 2 miles before his legs gave out, and Wren shifted the canvas sack of supplies to one shoulder and carried him on the other hip, the rifle slung at her back. The weight was not comfortable. She walked with it anyway, her gray eyes fixed on the pale line of the chalk formation visible against the sky ahead. The thing that everyone else had rejected becoming, with each step, more specifically hers. Ezra Dunmore found her 4 days later. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. The chalk formation carried sound in odd ways, and the steady beat of hooves on dry ground reached the cave mouth, while Dunmore was still a dark shape coming from the east. He rode a bay mare that moved with the economical gait of an animal that had covered a great deal of Nebraska ground without hurrying. The man in the saddle was 58 years old, his family Scottish by origin, but Nebraska by 2 generations of birth and labor, with a face that whined and squinting, had worked into deep creases, wearing a coat that had been good once and was still functional, which was all it needed to be. He did not dismount immediately. He stopped the horse 20 feet from the cave entrance and studied the situation the way an experienced man studies terrain, noting the approach, the shelter quality, the resource situation, the vulnerability. Then he looked at Ren with a direct assessment of someone who has learned that looking away from difficult things doesn't make them easier. His voice when he spoke was measured. "You're the widow from Ohio." Not a question. He'd already confirmed it somewhere along the line, probably at the land office. She said she was. He dismounted, walked to the cave entrance, stood just inside with his hands on his hips, and looked at the limestone walls, the uneven floor, the water stains, the children's blankets folded in the back. He stood there longer than most people would have. Then he turned around and his face carried an expression Ren had not seen before, but understood immediately, the face of a man delivering a verdict he takes no pleasure in, but won't soften out of false kindness. Ezra Dunmore had been in Nebraska for 9 years. He had survived 9 winters in Asadi 3 miles east. He had watched 2 men freeze in blizzards and 1 family starve when their crops failed in succession. He understood the arithmetic of prairie survival in the way that only experience creates understanding, not from reading, but from having made the calculations with his own survival as the variable. He told her what she needed: 8 cords of firewood minimum, 200 pounds of preserved food, a proper structure with insulated walls. He said it without cruelty, laying it out, item by item, the way you lay out the components of a repair job before starting. This is what the problem requires. These are the parts. This is the labor. Then, "I've seen men with twice your resources give up by Christmas. A woman alone with children living in a limestone hole." He paused, making sure she was hearing him. "You won't make it to spring." Della had gone very still beside the blanket pile. Coop was outside with his stones. Ren thought about the calculations she'd been running for 4 nights. 8 cords versus 15 degrees of temperature differential. The dome she hadn't built yet. The tin cans accumulating twice weekly behind Pryor's store. She thought about the number that the impossible arithmetic had eventually produced after 3 nights of turning it over, the number that said it could work if every assumption held. "I've survived worse," she said, and knew even as she said it that it wasn't quite the right response, that surviving a husband's death and a bank's accounting were not the same category of survival as a Nebraska winter. But the alternative was explaining a plan that didn't exist yet, in physical form only in her head, and she had learned in 8 years of teaching that explaining something you haven't demonstrated yet is the weakest possible argument. Dunmore looked at her steadily. "Have you cut 8 cords of wood by yourself? Have you hunted through 3 feet of snow? Have you kept a fire going for 4 months straight while nursing sick children?" He paused to make sure she was hearing him. 8 cords, that's what you need. For a proper cabin with a good stove. For whatever you're planning to do here, I don't know what you'd need. Nobody survives a prairie winter in a limestone cave. There's a reason for that. Ren didn't answer immediately. The silence between them held the particular quality of 2 people in disagreement about something that time will eventually settle. "I'll check on you in October," Dunmore said finally. "If you're still alive, we can talk about whether there's something worth doing before the hard cold sets in." He remounted, looking down at her from the height of the saddle. "I'm not trying to discourage you for its own sake. I'm telling you because I don't want to find a dead woman and 2 children in a limestone cave come February. It happens, more often than people in Columbus think." He rode east without looking back. Ren turned to face the cave. 18 feet deep, 9 feet wide at the mouth. 54 degrees in August, which meant 54 degrees in January, which meant the gap she had to close was 15 degrees instead of 65, which meant the wood she needed was a fraction of what every experienced person in Harlan County had just told her she couldn't gather. She had everything she needed. It just wasn't in its final form yet. The tin collecting began September 1st. She made the dustfall trip twice a week, 9 miles each way, with the canvas sack on her back and both children walking. The first trip yielded 43 cans of varying sizes, enough to fill the sack to capacity. The second trip added 61 because Pryor had collected from the hotel as promised. By the end of the second week, she had over 200 cans stacked in the back of the cave, where she spent evenings flattening them with a rock against the limestone floor, hammering each one until it lay more or less flat, the edges still sharp enough to draw blood if she wasn't careful, which she wasn't always. The hatchet she'd bought 78 cents at Pryor's, the cheapest one, went dull by the end of the first week at Bitterwater Creek. She sharpened it against sandstone and kept cutting. The willows there were thin and numerous, growing in dense stands along the water's edge, the kind of flexible young growth that bent without fighting back if you handled it right. She cut them at the base, stripped the side branches, hauled them 3 miles uphill in bundles that she tied with bark strips, and dragged more than carried on the steeper sections. Her shoulders ached in a continuous way she began to think of as structural rather than painful, the kind of ache that was simply the body's commentary on what it was being asked to do. Her hands cracked at the knuckles from constant wetting and drying. The blisters on her feet completed their cycle of forming, breaking, healing, and forming again with a regularity she stopped noticing. Della helped where she could. At 8 years old, she was strong for her size and better than her age at identifying what needed to happen next without being told. She handed tools, fetched water, kept track of Coop, while Wren wrestled with willow bundles or worked the flattening rock. She didn't complain about the thin suppers, dried beans cooked in creek water, flour biscuits. When there was enough, the occasional rabbit Wren brought down with the rifle in the blue hour before full dark. Della had absorbed in some way Wren hadn't explicitly taught that complaining was a kind of spending, and their budget for every resource was tight. Coop brought her things: a smooth gray stone with a stripe of white quartz through it, a primary feather from something large, probably a hawk, a dried seed head from a prairie flower he'd found near the base of the formation. He presented each one with the ceremonial seriousness of a person making an offering, which in its way it was his version of contribution, the thing he could do that the others couldn't, which was find what was worth noticing in the immediate ground and bring it forward. She accepted each one with equal seriousness and kept them on the limestone shelf near the cave entrance. The dome began on September 15th. She drove the first willow poles into the limestone floor, using the hatchet's butt end as a hammer, carving starter holes first with her knife tip. The chalk was soft enough, she'd been right about that. Then wedging the pole bases in tight, testing each one by pulling against it with both hands before moving to the next. She set 11 poles in a curved line across one side of the cave mouth and 11 across the other, each angled inward, spaced roughly 18 inches apart. Then she tried to bend them toward each other. The first two cracked. She stood looking at the split wood and understood what she'd done wrong. Willow was flexible when it was fresh cut and green, but she'd let these dry partially during the cutting and hauling process, and partially dry willow resisted bending with a stubbornness that was not obvious until it cracked. She needed to re-wet them. She spent an afternoon hauling water from the creek in the single pot she owned and soaking the remaining poles overnight, weighting them with stones to keep them submerged. The next morning they bent. Not easily. She had to work each pole, gradually bending a few inches and tying it in place, letting it hold for an hour, bending further, letting it hold again. It was slow in the way that precise work is slow, not because it couldn't go faster, but because going faster would break it. Della held the opposite end of poles when two hands weren't enough. Coop stacked the broken pieces of the two failed poles neatly to one side, understanding, without being told, that they would be firewood. By the end of September, the framework was taking shape. By the 1st of October, it was complete: 22 poles bent into a dome that spanned the cave mouth, 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall. At the center, lashed at their crossing points with bark strips covered with enough willow withes woven horizontally between the main poles to give the tin shingles something to wire against. It looked like the rib cage of a whale. Della stood back and tilted her head, studying it the way she studied arithmetic problems she hadn't solved yet. It looks like something that used to be alive and got left here. Then practically, is it strong enough? Wren pulled the nearest pole with both hands as hard as she could. The whole structure flexed and returned. Yes, she said. Coop had been watching from inside the cave, which put him behind the structure, looking out through the gaps between the poles at his mother and sister standing in the afternoon light. His voice came through the framework with a slight echo. Can whales be warm? Wren laughed, a short, real sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. And for a moment, the weight of every calculation she'd been carrying lifted completely, and there was only the chalk bluff, warm in the October sun, and her 2 children and a dome made of bent sticks that might, against every prediction, save their lives. She looked north. The horizon was the particular clear blue of early October in Nebraska, which was the blue that preceded change. Along the far edge, barely visible, the first dark suggestion of what the atmosphere was building in the weeks ahead. She went back to wiring tin. The tin shingles went on in rows bottom to top, each one overlapping the one below it by 2 inches. The way roof slates overlap on a proper house, which was a thing Wren had observed but never built. She wired each piece to the willow framework using thin strips of metal banding she'd salvaged from the same trash heap that supplied the cans, the kind used to secure shipping crates thrown out in coils, because it had no obvious retail purpose. Her fingers learned the wire quickly, the way fingers learn anything repeated enough times how tight to twist, before the metal fatigued, how much overlap was structural versus decorative, where the sharp ends needed to be folded back before they became a problem. The work was October work, which meant the sun gave light without much warmth. The wind had opinions about everything. The tin edges drew blood from her knuckles in thin red lines. She stopped noticing by the second week. Della worked beside her on the lower rows, handing pieces up, holding the framework steady when a gust caught the half-covered structure and made it shudder. Coop sat in the cave entrance behind them, both arranging his stone collection into formations. He named with complete seriousness the quartz-striped stone always at the center, the hawk feather wedged into a crack in the limestone above them all. By October 18th, 3/4 of the dome was covered. The gap remaining was at the top, a 2-foot opening at the apex where she couldn't reach without a platform she hadn't built yet. She'd been stacking flat limestone pieces into a rough column inside the cave, testing it each morning for stability, adding to it each evening. On the morning of October 19th, she climbed it before first light reached the gap, with arms stretched full overhead, wired the last 4 pieces into place in the dark, by feel rather than sight, and came down when the sky was going gray in the east. She pulled the canvas door, a doubled section of her original tarp, fitted to a frame of lashed willow across the entrance. The wind, which had been threading through every gap with the persistence of something alive, stopped. The silence inside was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of containment. She built a fire in the pit she'd dug near the entrance, a shallow depression lined with flat stones to hold heat, with a narrow gap in the upper tin work angled to draw smoke out without letting weather in. The wood was cottonwood scraps, not ideal burning wood, but what she had. The fire caught slowly, then settled into a steady, small flame, no larger than both her fists pressed together. She sat beside it for an hour, watching the temperature of the air change around her in a way she could feel on her face before she could measure it. Then she pressed her palm to the limestone wall. The rock was warm. Not fire warm, not the aggressive warmth of something recently heated, but the deep, slow warmth of thermal mass doing exactly what thermal mass does. Absorbing energy from the small fire, storing it in its own molecular structure, becoming a radiator that would release that stored heat for hours after the fire died down. The cave was behaving like an oven turned inside out, the heat source small, the walls doing the real work of distribution. Her thermometer was a glass tube she'd bought for 11 cents at the Dustfall store, the kind used for preserving marked-in increments rough enough to give estimates rather than precise readings. She'd suspended it on a strip of bark near the center of the space, away from direct fire influence. It read 61 degrees. Outside, the wind was measuring 38. Wren looked at the gap between those two numbers and understood with a certainty that didn't require celebration that the arithmetic had worked. Ezra Dunmore arrived 3 days later, just as she'd calculated he would. He'd said October, and it was October, and he was the kind of man who did what he said. He circled the completed dome twice before saying anything, testing the tin with his knuckles, pulling at the framework, where it met the cave walls, examining the mud and dried grass chinking she'd packed into the perimeter seam with her fingers. The chinking was not beautiful. It was lumpy, inconsistent in depth, the color of dried creek mud, which was what it was. It held. Dunmore stepped inside. She'd lit the fire before his horse appeared on the eastern approach, wanting to show him the space in operation rather than in theory. He stood in the center, hat in hand, looking at the thermometer, feeling the ambient warmth against his face. He pressed his own palm to the limestone wall the way she had 3 days earlier, and held it there longer than she had, as if double-checking the information. 58 degrees. He was reading the thermometer. With that fire, the fire was the size of a man's fist. He turned to face her, and she could see in his expression a man doing what honest men do when the evidence contradicts their experience. He was updating. Not dramatically, not with any performance of being proven wrong, but steadily, the way a careful mind adjusts when the numbers come back different than expected. The idea is sound, he said. and she could hear that the admission had cost him something, not pride exactly, but the comfort of a settled view of how things worked on a Nebraska winter. In theory, the cave holds its temperature. A small space is easier to heat than a large one. The pause before what came next was the pause of a man finishing his honest accounting before delivering the number that matters. How much wood do you have? Her stomach tightened before she answered. A quarter cord, perhaps a third. He didn't repeat it back to her. Repetition would have been theatrical, and he wasn't theatrical. He just looked at the wood pile stacked against the cave wall, then at the calendar in his head, then at her, and his face said everything that needed saying without saying it. From his saddlebag, he produced a canvas sack, dried venison, dense, dark enough protein to carry them through October if she rationed by weight rather than appetite. Then he told her he had cottonwood scraps from a fence repair, a quarter cord's worth, which he would bring if she would trade labor in the spring planting. Not charity. Exchange. The distinction mattered to him, and she respected that it did. She accepted before he finished the sentence. Then he said what she hadn't asked him to say but needed to hear. Walt Pryor asked me last week whether you'd survive to November. He wasn't asking because he was worried about you. He's been watching the county records on that bluff parcel. If your claim lapses, he wants to file within the day. She'd known. She'd felt it in the way Pryor's courtesy had a watchful quality beneath it, the way a man is polite to something he expects to become his eventually. Hearing it confirmed changed nothing about what she was doing, but it sharpened the stakes into a point she could feel in her sternum when she breathed. Dunmore left. She watched him go, then turned back to the dome, which was holding 60 degrees in mid-October, with a fire that would barely warm a man's hands. She went inside, sat down on the limestone floor, pressed her back against the warm wall, pulled her knees to her chest, and let herself hold all of it at once for exactly 5 minutes, the insufficient woodpile, the calculating man in dustfall, the winter that was building itself on the northern horizon, with the patient industry of weather systems that did not care what they destroyed. Then she got up. Coop's cough began the first week of November. She recognized it before she wanted to. Not the dry catch of a cold, not the sharp sound of something caught in a small throat. This was deeper, wetter, the sound of lungs working harder than they should to move air through passages that were narrowing. She'd heard it once before, not from Coop, but from Thomas in the first winter of their marriage when he'd come home from a week of night shifts in the mine, with fluid in his chest that the Columbus doctor had taken 3 months to clear. Thomas had been 24 years old, healthy otherwise, and it had still been 3 months. Coop was 5. His chest had never been his strongest part. She didn't change her expression when she heard it. Changing her expression would have told Della something, and Della was already paying attention to everything with more acuity than a child her age should need. Wren kept the fire slightly larger than she'd budgeted for through November, burning against her wood supply, with the controlled regret of spending savings you can't replace. The warmth was medicine. She had no other kind. The trips to Bitterwater Creek were running out of weather to happen in. She managed 2 more before the drifts made the 3-mile passage genuinely dangerous. Not impossible, but the calculation of risk versus return had tilted. Each trip yielded half a cord of dead cottonwood she found on the creek banks, dry enough to burn without seasoning. She dragged it more than carried it on the return, using the canvas sack as a sled over the snow's surface crust, falling twice on the second trip when the crust broke and her legs went through to the knee. On the second trip's return, she came over the last rise before the bluff and stopped. Through the cave entrance, through the dome's canvas door, which Della had left slightly open against the afternoon warmth, she could see her daughter. Della was standing at the limestone wall with a piece of charcoal from the fire pit writing letters. Capital letters, then their lowercase partners, then the numbers 1 through 20. Coop was sitting 3 feet away with his legs crossed, following the chalk marks with his finger in the air mouthing the shapes. His blanket was pulled up to his chin. His face was flushed from the fever that had been working at him for 2 weeks. But his eyes, tracking his sister's hand, were focused and clear. Wren stood in the snow outside the dome and did not go in for a long moment. She had been calculating this winter as a problem of resources, wood, food, temperature, time. She had been right to calculate it that way because those were the variables that would kill them if she got the numbers wrong. But standing outside in the cold, looking through the door at her daughter teaching arithmetic on a limestone wall, while her son sat sick in a blanket and followed along, she felt something shift in the architecture of what she was doing. She was not only keeping them alive, they were keeping themselves alive in every sense the phrase could carry beyond the merely physical. She went inside. She did not say anything about what she'd seen. She set down the wood, built the fire up 2 increments, and started supper. Her total wood supply after the 2 November trips, adding Dunmore's cottonwood to what she'd gathered over the summer, came to 3/4 of a cord. She sat with the number for a long evening while the children slept. 3/4 cord, 6 to 8 weeks of hard winter remaining after Christmas. At her current burn rate, keeping the temperature in the dome between 58 and 62 degrees, she had wood for 4 weeks. Perhaps 5 if she let the fire drop to embers during the warmest part of each afternoon. The gap between 4 weeks of fuel and 8 weeks of winter was not closable by any physical means she had available. The drifts outside were chest high in the low places. The 3 miles to Bitterwater Creek might as well be 30. She had examined this from every angle she could construct, and the examination kept returning the same answer: she was short, and there was no way to not be short. She held that knowledge the way you hold something sharp, carefully, fully aware of it, not allowing it to slip. Christmas Eve arrived on a Saturday. The temperature outside had been below zero since the 21st, the kind of cold that made the air feel dense, that coated every exposed surface with a white fur of ice crystals, that found every gap in the dome's chinking and sent a needle of cold through it that she'd spent 3 days stopping up. The interior held 56 degrees with a fire she'd kept at the minimum necessary, burning as little as she dared. She had 2 peppermint sticks she'd bought in Dustfall in October, 2 cents each, wrapped in paper at the bottom of the supply sack since then. She gave them to the children after the evening meal, which was bean soup thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl through. Della had been working on something for a week with the knife Wren lent her carefully in one of the spare tin pieces. She produced it now from under her blanket, a rough star-shaped, 6-pointed, the edges bent slightly, where she hadn't been able to get them fully flat, the surface marked with the careful labor of a child's hands, working with tools made for adults. She'd punched a hole in one point with the knife tip. She looked at her mother, then up at the apex of the dome framework. Wren lifted her onto her shoulders. Della reached up and tied the star to the highest crossing point of the willow poles with a strip of bark cord. When Wren set her down and built the fire up slightly for the occasion, the star caught the light and threw small reflections across the limestone walls. Not dramatically, not in a way that was beautiful by any conventional measure, but in the specific way that small light in complete darkness is always beautiful, which is to say, completely. Coop asked whether Santa Claus could find them in a cave with the sincerity of a 5-year-old who wasn't entirely sure about the logistics, but trusted that his mother had reliable information on the subject. Wren told him Santa Claus found everyone, which she believed was true in the sense that mattered. She told them about Ohio until they slept the house on Elm Street, with the porch that needed repainting, the schoolroom where she taught fractions to children who would grow up to use them without knowing they were using them, the way the creek behind the churchyard froze in patterns that looked design. She told these things as stories rather than losses, because the distinction between the two was a choice she was consciously making every sentence. After they slept, she counted the wood. She rebuilt the number from the physical evidence in front of her, the stacked pieces, the loose fragments, the bark scraps she'd saved because bark burned well and longer than its volume suggested. She counted twice, converting to chord fractions in her head with the precision she'd developed over months of making this same calculation. The result was the same both times. 4 weeks of fuel, 8 weeks of winter remaining, possibly 10 if the spring ran late, which it did in Nebraska, roughly 1 year and 3. On December 28th, she found the last sheet of blank paper she owned, the back of the lading receipt from the train, and sat down by the fire after both children were deeply asleep. She wrote a letter to her sister Margaret in Columbus. She wrote the truth. She wrote that she had made a miscalculation she hadn't seen coming, or had seen coming and chosen to believe she could outwork, which amounted to the same error. She wrote that she had built something real, something that functioned against all the predictions of everyone around her, that the dome held heat in a way that still struck her as slightly miraculous when she thought about it in certain moods. She wrote that she was short on fuel by a margin she couldn't close from where she was standing, that Coop's chest was worrying her, that she was afraid in the specific way you're afraid when you've done everything right and the numbers still don't add up. She folded the letter once. She sat with it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was the weight of accurate accounting. Then she held one corner to the fire. She watched it burn from the corner to the center, to the edge, the paper curling as it went, the ink going first dark, then gray, then nothing. She held it until the flame reached her fingers, then set the last piece in the fire pit and watched it finish. The letter was true. True was not the same as useful. What she needed was not an accurate description of her position. She already had that. What she needed was to get up the next morning and do whatever the next morning required, which was what every morning had required since August, which was what every morning would require until the spring made the requirement different. She was afraid. She had been afraid since Columbus. Fear was not the problem. The problem was the wood, and the wood was a problem she had not yet exhausted every option on. She had not yet walked the bluff perimeter in the morning light looking for deadfall she might have missed under the snow. She had not yet tried burning dried grass packed between larger pieces to extend the burn time. She had not yet asked Dunmore directly whether he had anything beyond what he'd already offered. She got up from the fire and went to sleep. Mabel Greer came on January 8th. She arrived without Heinrich on foot, wearing a coat that had been patched in 4 places and boots that showed the stress of a Nebraska winter on Indiana-made leather. Her face was red from the cold, but held an expression Wren hadn't seen on it before, the expression of a woman who has reconsidered something and is prepared to say so directly, which is not a small thing for a woman of 42 who has been certain about most things for a long time. She didn't offer an explanation for coming. She stepped inside the dome, took off her right glove, pressed her bare palm to the limestone wall, and held it there for a long moment. The wall was giving back the heat it had been storing for 3 days of moderate fire. Not fire warmth, not direct radiant heat, but the deep, steady release of thermal mass functioning exactly as Wren had theorized it would in the dark of the previous August. Then Mabel looked at the thermometer. Then she looked at the fire, which was not large. "Our soddy holds 38 degrees on the worst nights," she said, her voice carrying the flatness of a woman reporting data she finds inconvenient. "Heinrich stuffs rags in every crack he can find, and we still wake up with frost on the inside of the blankets." She moved her hand slowly along the limestone wall, then looked at Wren directly. "I told you this was a toy. I told you it was a play structure. I told you it wouldn't hold." Wren waited. "I was wrong." The words came out level without apology's usual cushioning of qualifications and deflections, which made them more substantial rather than less. "You understood something the rest of us didn't bother to understand. I'm sorry I said what I said in September." It was the first apology anyone had offered Wren since arriving in Nebraska. She discovered she didn't know how to receive it, that she'd been so long in the position of defending her choices against dismissal, that genuine acknowledgement of error was a texture she'd lost the ability to process quickly. She thanked Mabel, meaning it, feeling the awkwardness of meaning something in front of another person, after months of keeping everything functional rather than felt. Mabel left with a promise to send Heinrich to talk about construction principles. She thought they might add something to the soddy using the same logic. Not a cave, they didn't have a cave, but perhaps a stone-lined interior wall that would hold and release heat the way the limestone did here. It would be less effective. It would still be better than rags in the cracks. Wren watched her start the trek back north, then turned to look at the woodpile. Still the same number, still the same gap. Mabel's acknowledgement had changed nothing about the arithmetic, which was its own kind of instruction, that being right about something was not the same as being safe, that vindication was not a resource you could burn for warmth. January 11th arrived warm. Not warm by Ohio standards, not warm in any absolute sense, but warm by the measure of what preceded it. 42 degrees by midday, with a brightness in the air that came from actual solar heating rather than reflected snow glare. The drifts softened at their surfaces. Water ran in thin channels down the chalk face. Coop's breathing had steadied through the last 2 weeks, the dome's consistent warmth having done for his lungs what warmth does, giving them the thermal support needed to clear themselves slowly. He was still thin, still easily tired, but the deep rattling had quieted to something closer to normal. She let them go outside after 3 weeks of confinement. They moved into the midday light with the stunned relief of people emerging from a long interior blinking, recalibrating the scale of the world. Coop found new stones almost immediately. Della stood with her face tilted up to the sun and didn't say anything for a full minute, just receiving it. Wren looked north. The warmth was wrong, too sudden, too complete, the kind of temperature swing that had appeared in a single context in the geography reader she'd taught from for 8 years. She remembered the passage about atmospheric pressure systems on the Great Plains, about the warm air pushed ahead of a major cold front, moving down from Canada, the way water is pushed ahead of a submerging object. The textbook had used technical language she'd simplified for the children. But what she remembered most clearly was the illustration of the pressure map and the caption beneath it: warm air in advance of a system is not a reprieve. It is the system's announcement. The old farmers in Ohio had called it the lamb before the lion. She looked at the sky above the northern horizon and saw what she was looking for. Not clouds have edges, layers, the organic irregularity of water vapor in motion. What was building along the northern horizon was a wall, flat-bottomed, dark, stretching from the eastern edge of her vision to the western without interruption, advancing at a pace that was deliberate. The way geological things are deliberate, not fast but continuous, stopping for nothing, indifferent to what lay in its path. It was swallowing the stars along its leading edge as the light faded, replacing them with a solid darkness that had weight to it, that pressed against the sky it displaced. She brought the children inside while the temperature was still 38 degrees. She filled every container she owned with meltwater running off the chalk face, the cooking pot, both tin cups, the spare flour sack, sealed at its bottom with beeswax saved from a candle stub. She packed the perimeter, chinking with fresh mud from the melt channels, pressing it in with her thumb, wherever she could feel a draft. She built the fire up to the highest level she'd used since early October, loading it with the best wood remaining rather than the scraps. Because tonight was not a night for conservation. Tonight was a night to put as much thermal energy into the limestone walls as possible before whatever was building to the north arrived. She checked the wood pile after she was done. The pile looked back at her with the silence of a finite resource that could not be negotiated with. Della had been watching her move through these preparations with the attention of a child who has learned to read her mother's urgency the way a barometer reads pressure. Her voice when she spoke was quiet. "What's coming, Mama?" Wren looked at her daughter, 8 years old, thin from a winter of careful portions, with her mother's gray eyes and a composure that had been forged rather than inherited. She gave her the truth because Della had earned the truth by handling every previous truth without flinching. A storm, a serious one. Della looked at the dome walls, the sealed tin, the chinking, the fire. She assessed it the way her mother had taught her to assess arithmetic problems, not with fear, but with inventory, checking what was known against what was required. Then she looked back at Wren and asked the only question that mattered: will it hold? Wren put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. "The shelter will hold." She said it with more certainty than she had any right to feel, which was exactly the right amount of certainty to offer a child on the night before the worst storm in Nebraska's recorded history. At 11 that night, the wind began. Not gusting, not building from a lower level, simply present suddenly at full force, as though a door had been thrown open somewhere to the north, and all of winter had walked through it at once. The dome shuddered. The tin shingles, which had been silent for weeks, began their percussion against the willow framework, not the occasional ping of thermal expansion, but a continuous roar of metal flexing wire, straining the whole structure, expressing in sound the forces it was being asked to resist. Coop woke. His eyes went to the walls, which were moving in the way that a wall is not supposed to move, flex, and return with each sustained gust. Wren already had him before he could speak, already had her arms around him, already had Della pulled close on her other side. The temperature outside was dropping. She could feel it even inside, in the quality of the air near the canvas door, in the way the fire bent sideways when new gaps opened, in the chinking under wind load. She got up, Coop on her hip, and spent 20 minutes stopping new gaps with whatever was at hand: cloth strips, bark, the last of the mud from the interior bucket. Outside, in the complete dark, in the roaring white, nothing that was becoming the night of January 12th. 1888, other people were trying to reach safety. She did not know that yet. She was focused on the dome, on the fire, on the wood, on Coop's breathing. She was holding everything she could hold. The world outside this tin walls had its own accounting running, and it was not yet done with its work. The wind had been screaming for 2 hours when Wren heard something underneath it. She had been cataloging the dome's sounds the way a sailor catalogs a ship's sounds in a storm, learning which noises were structural complaint versus structural failure, which rattles were the tin expanding under wind load versus tin coming loose at the wire joints. The dome had its own vocabulary now, a language she'd been building since October, and she trusted her ability to read it. So when a sound appeared that didn't belong to the dome's vocabulary, she heard it immediately. A rhythm. Not the wind's rhythm, which was continuous and structureless. Something else, a pattern of impact. Brief silences, impact again. Deliberate. The sound of something hitting stone at intervals too regular to be debris. She pressed her ear to the canvas door, and the cold came through the canvas itself, the temperature differential so severe that the fabric had stiffened at its edges. The sound was to the left of the entrance, somewhere along the chalk face, close enough that it shouldn't have been audible through the storm, but was because the bluff channeled sound the same way it channeled wind, concentrating it at the entrance. Someone was outside. Wren looked at her children. Della was awake, sitting with her back against the warm limestone wall, feeding the fire with the precise economy she'd developed over months. A piece and watch it catch. Wait another piece. Coop was asleep against Della's side, his breathing audible but not alarming. The fever that had spiked at nightfall, sitting at a level Wren had decided was survivable rather than critical. The wood pile had perhaps 4 hours left at current burn rate. She took the clothesline rope, 40 feet of braided cotton she'd bought for 11 cents in September, tied one end to the base of the willow doorframe, with 3 half hitches wrapped the other end around her waist twice. Della watched her do this without speaking. Then Wren looked at her daughter. Keep the fire exactly where it is. Not larger. Don't open this door for anyone except me. Della's voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been tested enough times to know their own strength. Come back, Mama. Wren pulled the canvas door open and the storm came in like something that had been waiting for permission. The cold was not cold in any sense she had previous experience with. Cold in Ohio was a temperature. This was a physical force of pressure that hit every exposed surface of her face simultaneously and began its work immediately, the kind of work that doesn't hurt at first because the nerves shut down before they can report back. She was blind within one step. The white was not the white of snow in daylight. It was the white of complete sensory erasure, the visual equivalent of a sound so loud it registers as silence. She went left along the bluff face, one hand trailing against the limestone. The rope played out behind her. She moved toward the rhythm she'd heard, which was still there, which meant whoever was making it was still alive, still had enough in them to keep hitting stone with whatever they were hitting it with. 10 steps from the door. 15. The rope was running out of slack. Her hand found something that wasn't stone. Fabric. A coat. A shoulder inside the coat, and beneath the shoulder a body that was trying to be smaller than it was, compressed against the base of the chalk face, in the posture of someone who has stopped moving. Not because they chose to stop, but because movement had become unavailable. Wren grabbed the coat with both hands pulled, got the weight moving, got an arm under what turned out to be a shoulder, got the person upright against her own body's resistance, against the wind. A face turned toward her. Ice had formed on the eyebrows, on the lashes, on the fine hairs at the hairline. The lips were moving, but the wind took the sound before it reached Wren's ears. She didn't need to hear the words. She needed to move. She turned back toward the dome with the person's arm across her shoulders and the wind now directly in her face rather than at her side. The rope guided her back. She found the canvas door by following the rope to its end, got the door open, got them both inside, got it closed behind them. The warmth of the interior hit like something physical after the erasure outside. The woman on the floor was Mabel Greer. Her coat was stiff with ice at the collar. Her hair, where it had escaped her hat, had frozen into individual strands that clinked against each other when she moved her head. Her eyes were open, tracking which was the most important information available. Della had the blanket off her own shoulders and across Mabel before Wren could ask for it. The story came out in pieces as Mabel thawed her voice, returning in increments as the cold released its grip on her throat. 9 people walking the road toward the Thompson homestead, 3 miles east. A gathering that had been planned for 2 weeks, neighbors, checking on neighbors in the way that scattered prairie communities maintain their sense of not being entirely alone. The storm had hit without warning while they were on the road, the temperature dropping so fast that the air seemed to change its nature between one breath and the next. People scattered. Heinrich had gone one direction. She'd gone another. She'd walked until she hit the bluff face and couldn't go further. She'd hit it with her fist to make noise because she'd seen the dome from the road when she'd visited 3 weeks ago, and she knew there was something here. if she could only make herself heard. 9 people on the road that ran within 100 yards of the dome entrance. Wren did the calculation instantly. 9 people in the open in a storm that had already dropped the temperature to what she estimated was 30 below, given the rate of ice formation on Mabel's coat. If they were on the road when the storm hit, they scattered from the road, which meant they could be anywhere within the area the road crossed before the next shelter, which was the Thompson place 3 miles further east. Some of them might still be close. She tied the rope's free end to a jutting limestone knob on the bluff face, 6 feet from the door, a fixed anchor point that would give her the full 40 feet of range rather than losing a third of it to the interior. She told Della to watch Mabel watch Coop watch the fire. She went back out. The second trip was different from the first because she knew now what she was moving into, which was both better and worse better because she wasn't surprised by the erasure of visibility. Worse because she had to choose to walk into it voluntarily with full knowledge of what it would do to her in the minute she was outside. She went east along the bluff base, playing the rope out, calling into the wind. At intervals she calculated would carry sound to someone within 30 feet if the gusts allowed. Heinrich Greer was 60 yards east of the dome entrance on his hands and knees on the ground, moving in a direction that was approximately east, which was approximately wrong. His hands had been in contact with the snow long enough that they'd frozen into a position between open and closed fingers, curled unable to grip. She got his coat collar in her fist, got him upright, walked him back west along the bluff until they hit the anchor knob, then followed the rope to the door. Inside again. Della had built the fire up 1 increment without being asked. Reading the situation correctly, more bodies in the space would require more heat to compensate for the cold they brought in on their clothing. 8 years old, making thermal calculations in real time. The woodpile was visibly smaller. Wren went out a third time. The cold was doing something to her hands now that she recognized as frostbite's first stage. Not pain, the opposite of pain. A numbness that felt like her hands were becoming theoretical rather than actual present in her awareness, but no longer fully connected to sensation. She kept them moving, kept the blood circulating through deliberate opening and closing, which was something she could do consciously even when she couldn't feel whether she was doing it. She heard the child before she found the mother. A sound so thin it shouldn't have been audible in the storm's roar, but high-pitched enough to cut through in the frequency range the wind's own noise didn't occupy. She moved toward it off the rope's line now into territory where finding her way back would require relying on the wind direction rather than a physical guide. Cora Miller had put her body between her 2-year-old daughter and the wind curling around the child in the posture of a person who has decided that her own survival is a secondary question. The child was still making sound, which meant the child was alive, which meant Cora's decision was working. Getting them both upright was a problem of weight distribution that Wren solved by putting the child against her own chest inside her coat, leaving her hands free to hold Cora's arm, walking them back toward where the wind said the bluff should be. The bluff was where the wind said it would be. The rope was where she'd left it. Inside again. 5 people now in a space built for 3, the air temperature dropping with each door opening, the fire working to compensate. The woodpile was down to what Wren estimated as 3 hours of fuel at current burn rate. She did not share this calculation with the room. She went out a 4th time. The temperature by now was something she couldn't estimate rationally because her reference points had been stripped away. She knew it was below -20 because of what was happening to her exposed skin. But below that threshold, the precise number stopped mattering, and only the fact of it mattered. She had been outside 4 times. Her hands were white at the fingertips in a way that wouldn't resolve with movement. Her face, where she could feel it at all, felt wooden like a mask worn over her actual face. She found Cal Pryor 25 feet from the dome entrance, face down in a drift-oriented east-northeast, which was perpendicular to the direction of safety. He had stopped moving. He was breathing. She established this by pressing her numb fingers against the back of his neck and feeling the faint warmth there. But he had passed beyond the point where his body would generate the initiative to save itself. She rolled him over. His face was the face of someone 17 years old who had been out in this for too long, the color wrong, the eyes closed. She knew who Sonny was. Walt Pryor's only child. The son of the man who had offered her tin cans with one hand while calculating the timing of her failure with the other, who had watched her walk out of his store with his refuse while already composing the paperwork he'd file when she was dead. She stood in the white nothing, holding the boy's coat, and paused for exactly the length of time it took her heart to complete one full beat. The pause was not cruelty, and it was not calculation. It was the momentary weight of what it means to help someone who belongs to your enemy, to refuse to let that belonging matter, when the alternative is a boy dying in the snow 25 feet from warmth. Then she hauled him upright, got his weight across her shoulders in the carry she'd used for Heinrich, walked the 25 feet to the dome entrance, got him inside. 6 people. The fire was the size of one fist. The woodpile was 2 hours. She went out a 5th time, then a 6th, moving the full extent of what her legs would carry her, calling into the wind until her throat was raw, finding nothing. Finding nothing. The road had given up what it was going to give. She came back inside after the 6th trip and closed the door behind her and stood against it while her vision adjusted to the firelight. Mabel, fully conscious now, her hands wrapped in cloth strips Della had torn from the spare canvas spoke from across the space. "You can't go again. Look at your hands." Wren looked at her hands. The fingertips of both were white from the first knuckle down, waxy, slightly swollen. She couldn't feel them. She knew what that meant with the same precision. She knew what fuel consumption rates meant. It was data. It had implications. The implications were serious. Another trip in this temperature, with hands in this condition, risked permanent damage to the structures that made her hands functional, which made her functional, which made her children safe. She also knew that Arthur Miller was somewhere on the road with his 2 older children. She had not found them on any of her 6 trips. She didn't know if they were beyond the range she could reach, or if they had found shelter somewhere else, or if the storm had already made the question moot. Cal Pryor spoke from the floor near the fire, his lips still blue, his voice carrying the tremor of someone whose core temperature was climbing back from a dangerous depth. "My father said you'd die here. He said this shelter was worthless. He said—" The tremor interrupted him, then released. "He was wrong. You saved my life. But if you go out again, you'll lose those hands, and everyone in here will be alone when the fire burns out. You can't save everyone." A pause full of something that sounded like a young man encountering for the first time the difference between what he'd been told and what he'd seen. "You've done enough." The room held that sentence. Wren looked at Coop asleep against Della's side, his color better than it had been at nightfall, his breathing regular in the warm air. The dome was working to maintain against the storm's pressure. She looked at the fire. She looked at the woodpile. She looked at her white-tipped hands. She stayed. The blizzard lasted 18 hours from its beginning ending, sometime after midnight on January 13th, the wind stopping between one moment and the next, the silence arriving with the physical weight of something long held, finally released. The temperature outside in that silence was 18 below zero. The stars came out with the indifferent brilliance of things that observe without participating. Inside the dome, the fire had burned to coals by 4 in the morning. The woodpile was gone. The temperature dropped from 52 degrees at midnight to 44 by dawn, cold, but survivable because the limestone walls were releasing their stored heat into the air at the slow, steady rate of stone that has spent months learning what to hold. Nobody in the dome was dying at 44 degrees. Ezra Dunmore arrived at 7 in the morning with 3 men from the eastern homesteads following the trail the storm had left along the bluff base. They broke through a drift that had built against the dome's entrance during the night, the tin shingles visible underneath the accumulated snow intact. When the canvas door opened, Dunmore stood in the entrance and counted the people inside, the way a man counts something he isn't sure he believes. 8 people. Alive. He stepped inside, looked at the dead fire, the empty woodpile, the temperature reading on the thermometer 43 degrees. He looked at Wren, taking inventory of what the night had cost her, the frostbitten hands she was holding carefully away from, contact with anything, the exhaustion in her face that was past the kind that sleep could fix, the particular stillness of someone who has spent everything available and is now simply waiting to find out if it was enough. He didn't press his hand to the wall this time. He looked at the wall and then looked at Wren, and what passed between them was the wordless acknowledgement of a man who has been wrong about something important and knows it without needing to perform the knowing. Arthur Miller and his 2 older children were found that afternoon by a search party working east from the bluff. They had wandered off the road in the whiteout, moving in the circular pattern that disorientation produces in featureless terrain, a cruel geometry that feels like progress while it kills you. They were 400 yards from the road when the cold finished its work. At their closest approach to the bluff, they had been within 300 yards of the dome entrance. Wren received this information from one of the men Dunmore had brought, who told her without preamble because preamble wouldn't change what had happened. She received it the same way she received arithmetic that didn't close fully, without looking away, without the refuge of believing it might be otherwise. Arthur Miller's death was not her failure. She had gone out 6 times. The rope's reach was 40 feet. The road was 100 yards from the entrance, and some distances could not be covered, and knowing that did not make the distance smaller. The weight of what she couldn't save settled alongside the weight of what she had saved, and she carried both because that was what the truth required. Coop's fever broke 2 days after the storm. Not dramatically, there was no identifiable crisis point, no single moment of turning. Just a morning when she put her hand to his forehead, and the heat was gone, replaced by the normal temperature of a child who is tired rather than sick. He slept for 18 hours after that, the deep restorative sleep of a body that has finished fighting something. When he woke, his first request was for water. His second was to know if his stones were still where he'd left them. They were. The doctor came from Arapahoe 3 weeks after the storm, when the roads were passable enough to travel. He was a compact man named Jessup, who had been practicing in southwestern Nebraska for 11 years and had the manner of someone who has seen enough that very little surprises him anymore. He examined Coop with the thoroughness of someone who charges by the diagnosis, then told Wren that the boy had survived a moderate pneumonia, that the fact of his survival was attributable in large part to sustained warmth, that cold air in a pneumonia patient's environment was the primary complicating factor, that maintaining 60 degrees through the acute phase was in his clinical experience the difference between cases that resolved and cases that required intervention. He often couldn't provide in time anyway. He looked at the dome with the assessment of a man who categorizes things professionally. What is this exactly? Wren explained it. The limestone's thermal mass, the dome structure, the reduced temperature differential, the fuel efficiency that followed from fighting 15 degrees instead of 65. Jessup listened with the focused attention of someone filing information rather than making conversation. Then he said he had 3 patients in the county with respiratory conditions that made their standard housing dangerous in winter, and he would like to send them to speak with her. Walt Pryor came to Rimrock Bluff 10 days after the storm. He came alone on horseback on a morning when the temperature had climbed back above zero for the first time since the 12th. He didn't dismount immediately. He sat on his horse at a distance from the dome and looked at it for a long time. The tin shingles, the willow framework visible at the edges, where the snow had blown clear, the chalk face behind it, the thin line of smoke from Wren's morning fire, rising from the gap at the apex into the cold, clear air. He was looking at it the way a man looks at evidence he has been presented with against his will. Cal came out from the cave entrance when he heard the horse still moving carefully, with his recovering hands wrapped in cloth. He stood on the ground in front of his father on horseback, and the geometry of it, son below, father above, didn't resolve the way it usually did, because the boy had been inside the dome for 10 days, and the father had not. And that difference had rearranged something between them that couldn't be rearranged back. Cal's voice when he spoke was level. "This woman saved my life. You were wrong about her." Walt Pryor looked at his son, looked at the dome, looked at Wren, who was standing at the entrance with her bandaged hands at her sides, not performing anything, simply present. Simply the person who had built the thing that his son had survived inside of, while the worst storm in Nebraska's history tried to kill everyone it could reach. He said nothing. He turned his horse and rode back toward Dustfall. The claim on Rimrock Bluff was never filed. The subject was never raised again in his store or anywhere Wren heard about. Sometimes justice arrives in the form of a man who has run out of things to say. The spring came in stages the way it always did in Nebraska, advancing then retreating, the warmth negotiating with the cold over weeks before the cold finally yielded. Wren's hands healed slowly, the sensation returning to her fingertips over 6 weeks in the prickling, uncomfortable way that frostbitten tissue heals, never quite back to what they had been, but functional, which was the only standard that mattered. Ezra Dunmore came when the ground softened and taught her what he'd promised he would, how to break the chalk soil at the bluff's base, where it had accumulated enough organic matter over decades to support root vegetables. How to read the drainage patterns to find the places that wouldn't flood in the spring melt. How to sequence the planting to get the longest possible season out of Nebraska's abbreviated growing window. He worked beside her without discussion of payment, without reference to the labor debt she'd agreed to in October. When she raised it, he told her the debt had been settled by a different accounting he'd been running since the morning of January 13th. Mabel Greer brought Heinrich in March when his hands had healed enough to hold tools. They spent 2 days examining the Sadi's interior, discussing thermal mass, talking through what stone lining would do to the space's heat retention. Wren drew diagrams on the limestone wall with charcoal, explaining the principles the way she'd once explained fractions to children who would use them without knowing they were using them. Heinrich asked precise, practical questions. Mabel wrote the answers in the notebook she'd brought with the focused attention of a woman who has been wrong about something and intends not to be wrong about the same thing twice. The dome design spread the way useful things spread in communities where survival is a collective problem rather than an individual competition. Person to person with modifications for local materials, adapted for spaces that weren't caves, applied to problems the original designer hadn't anticipated. By the end of March, 2 homesteaders had begun stone-lined additions to their sod houses. By midsummer, 4 more had added some version of the thermal mass principle to their existing structures. The design didn't carry Wren's name when it traveled because practical things rarely do. It carried only the logic of the thing itself, which was sufficient. She taught anyone who asked, refusing payment for the teaching, which confused some people who interpreted the refusal as either false modesty or strategic positioning. It was neither. She explained it once to a farmer named Obert, who pushed the question, "What I built because there was no other option. Charging someone for a solution to a problem that might kill them is a thing I'm not willing to do." Obert went home and built a stone-lined root cellar that kept his family's food supply through the following winter without freezing. He named his next daughter Wren. Coop spent the spring outdoors as much as the weather allowed, building increasingly elaborate stone formations in the area below the chalk face, cataloging prairie grasses by root structure, following Dunmore around the planning work with the focused attention of a child who has identified something worth understanding. His chest was clear. He ran without stopping for the first time in his life, the dry prairie air agreeing with him in a way the mine town air of Columbus never had. Della turned 9 in May and spent her birthday teaching herself long division on the limestone wall, working problems she'd constructed herself, checking her answers by working backward. She asked Wren when she could go back to school. Wren told her the truth: there was no school in range. Then she told her the other truth, that a person who could teach herself long division on a cave wall had already demonstrated that the absence of a school building was a logistical problem rather than an intellectual one. Della considered this founded accurate in return to her problems. The 5 years required by the Homestead Act passed in the way that years pass when they are filled with the concrete work of a life, not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific texture of time that is being used rather than spent. Wren planted, harvested, hunted, built, repaired, taught, learned. She improved the dome each year with whatever materials became available, a proper iron stovepipe to replace the angled tin gap. In the second year, a fitted wooden door to replace the canvas in the third, a stone floor laid piece by piece as she accumulated enough flat limestone from the bluff's natural shedding. The cave became over time a place that visitors describe with surprised appreciation rather than the charitable pity of the first year. Mabel and Heinrich built the stone-lined addition to their soddy in the spring of 1888, applying the principles Wren had laid out on her limestone wall. They named their first son, born that December, Cooper, after the boy who had coughed through the blizzard while his mother went out into it 6 times. Heinrich's frostbitten hands healed fully except for the tip of one finger on his left hand, which he lost to the damage. He considered this a reasonable accounting for what the night of January 12th had cost and what it had returned. Wren filed the final paperwork in 1892 in the same Dustfall land office where Edwin Marsh had watched her sign the original claim with an expression that anticipated her death. Marsh had retired. The new clerk processed the paperwork without ceremony, stamped it in 3 places, handed back her copy. Wren folded the paper twice, put it in her coat pocket, walked back out into the Dustfall street. She stood there for a moment in the autumn light, holding the paper that said the land was hers, the land that everyone had told her she couldn't survive on, couldn't improve, couldn't prove up, couldn't hold against a Nebraska winter with $8 and no one to help her. The land that had, in fact, held her. The land whose stone had stored warmth in its own structure and given it back slowly through the coldest night in the county's recorded history to the 8 people sheltering inside the thing she'd built from bent sticks and someone else's garbage. She walked home to Rimrock Bluff. The years after that were quiet in the way that years after a long effort are quiet. Not empty, not without difficulty, but no longer organized around the possibility of imminent destruction. The dome became a home in the fullest sense, which meant it accumulated the evidence of people living in it. Della's continuing arithmetic on the limestone walls now advanced enough that she'd moved to algebra and was corresponding with a teacher in Arapahoe who had agreed to direct her reading. Coop's stone collection, which had outgrown 3 shelving systems and begun to be organized by geological type rather than size. The dents in the wooden doorframe where the iron stove's flue pipe had been adjusted a dozen times to get the draw right. Wren Calloway died at Rimrock Bluff in 1919, in the cave where she had once held a feverish child while the worst storm in Nebraska's recorded history tried to find a way through the tin walls. She was 66 years old. Della was there, 40 years old by then, a school teacher in Arapahoe who made the ride to the bluff every Sunday with enough reliability that the road between them had worn itself into a visible track. Coop was there, 37 years old, running a small cattle operation east of Dustfall on land he'd claimed in his own name when he turned 21. He still had the stone with the white quartz stripe, the first one he'd brought to his mother in the August of 1887, which he kept on the windowsill of his house for reasons he didn't explain when people asked and didn't need to. They buried her on the bluff's highest point, where the chalk formation met the open sky, where she had stood many times looking north to read what the weather was building. The grave faced south, away from the direction the bad things had always come from. The tin star Della had made on Christmas Eve of 1887 hung in the Harlan County Historical Museum beginning in 1923, when Della donated it along with a written account of the winter of 1887 to 1888. The star was tarnished by then, its 6 rough points bent from years of being moved and handled, the faint ghost of a pressed tin label still visible on one surface if the light hit it at the right angle, a remnant of what the can had been before an 8-year-old's hands and her mother's knife made it into something else. The card mounted below it read, "Christmas 1887, Rimrock Bluff, Nebraska. Made by a girl who understood what her mother knew: the earth keeps its own warmth. You only have to know how to use it." In a certain quality of afternoon light, the low oblique light coming through the western windows in the hour before the museum closed, the star still threw small reflections across the display case glass. Not far, not dramatically, just small points of light moving across the surface as people walk past, the way light moves across any reflective thing, the way warmth moves through stone that has learned to hold it. Slow, steady, longer than anyone who didn't know the physics would expect. The storm had passed. The star remained. The earth, as it had always done, kept its own temperature, patient, indifferent to the seasons above, it waiting for someone to understand what that patience was worth.